Every interview starts with the same question. Could you please introduce yourself and say what it is that you are known for?
So I'm Cathy Rogers, and I'm here because I'm known as the creator and producer of Junkyard Wars and Scrapheap Challenge.
What is your earliest memory of film or television, whichever came first?
So I think my earliest memory is of television rather than film, and it's watching a show that probably you won't know because it was on in England, which was a show called Grange Hill, which was a drama set in a school. And it was one of those obviously very relatable things because all of the characters in it were kind of the same age as the people watching, but the jinks and scrapes they got into were slightly more exciting than the jinks and scrapes we were getting into. So that was one thing I remembered. And then there were a couple of things that are also early memories that were more because they were excuses for being allowed to stay up a bit later than normal. And there are two that came to mind. One was a show called Mastermind, which is, it's the simplest kind of quiz show, really. It's just normal members of the public choose a specialized subject. So it might be kind of alpine flowers, or it might be James Bond movies, or it might be the complete works of Shakespeare. And they have a load of questions about that subject, and then a load of general knowledge questions. And whoever scores the most is then eventually, after many rounds, crowned the Mastermind champion. And it was on a Sunday night, and it was kind of one of those shows that I think parents don't mind their kids watching because it feels like self-improvement. But it was on a bit late, borderline bedtime. So we used to plead to watch that one so that we'd be allowed up a bit later. And there was another show which I kind of remembered, maybe because I was thinking about the link to shows that I then was involved in, which is called The Great Egg Race, which again, it was kind of a idiosyncratic British show with lots of sort of boffiny academics. And each week they had a challenge where they had to do something to an egg, like they had to make a machine that could fly an egg, or that could make an egg land safely from a 20th story of dropping from the 20th floor of a building. Or I can't really remember very many examples, but it was kind of famous here. It had a very eccentric host called Heinz Wolf, and it was kind of about crazy geeks building stuff. So there's an obvious connection.
Were you the kind of child that built stuff?
No, I wasn't really. I was more I did a lot of music as a child, and because the other half of my career, which we might touch on, is not really a career, but a glorified hobby, was playing in a band. But all the time when I was a child, I did a lot of playing piano, playing in orchestras, playing all sorts of things. And I did quite a lot of sport. And a lot of I grew up in a little village with, a few hundred people. And it was quite, until you could drive, you couldn't get anywhere. So the main entertainment was sort of running around the village having water fights with other kids. So I was more doing that kind of thing. I didn't really build stuff, didn't really take things apart. I wasn't someone who, my mum would come home and find the TV with its back off. That wasn't really me.
What was your formal education like?
So I went to the local primary school, which had 100 kids in the whole school. So kind of mixed age groups in a class because there weren't enough kids to have a class for every year. And then where I lived was in a part of the country where they have an exam system called the 12 plus, where you take an exam at the end of primary school. And if you pass, you go to a grammar school, which is a more kind of academic school. And if you don't pass, you go to a secondary modern, which at the time kind of taught more kind of vocational subjects, as well as obviously, the regular subjects, but it was more kind of geared towards vocational training. It's a pretty hideous, anachronistic system, but it meant I went then to a grammar school, which was a girls' school, fairly straight-laced, quite academic, and I was quite competitive, I suppose, did quite well. And then I went to Oxford to do my first degree in something called Human Sciences. And then I left that. I decided I kind of didn't know what to do at the end of that, even though I'd really loved doing that degree, which is a kind of bit of a potpourri of lots of different subjects, from social anthropology through to genetics through to geography. And then I studied medicine I went into it planning to finish the whole thing, because at the time I wanted to be an epidemiologist, which of course now I'm thinking, hey, that would have been a great job. But I really, really hated medicine, and I stopped doing it after about 4 years, because I just thought, I kind of still think that I would have quite liked to be a doctor, but at the time I thought it's going to take another 10 years of studying to get to the point where I'm going to have enough sort of autonomy to enjoy it. So I decided to stop. Yeah, that's my education in a nutshell.
What was your first job in the world of broadcasting, and how did you acquire that position?
So there was actually a connection here. So after I gave up medicine, I really, really didn't know what to do. Like, I remember sitting in my flat and I had a blank sheet of paper and I literally wrote down every job I could think of and gave it marks out of 10. And one thing I've always been interested in was journalism and kind of TV journalism. And I managed to get a meeting with somebody at Channel 4 to just kind of ask for careers advice. And it was one of those very lucky things where, you know, I just must have got someone on a good day. They agreed to meet me. We had a chat, and he mentioned, because Channel 4 doesn't make its own programs, it commissions independent production companies to make them. And the guy who I saw, who was the head of news and current affairs, mentioned a show that was just starting up production called The Pulse, which was a health series, a series all about health. And he gave me the number, or whatever, number in those days, pre-email, of the woman who was the series producer. And I spoke to her, and they said that they were actually looking for a junior researcher to be part of the team who had some kind of medical knowledge. So that was exactly what I had, some slightly kind of half-baked medical knowledge. So I went to then have an interview with her, and I got that job, and then worked on that series and did. So my first job was I had to phone all the MPs, members of Parliament, and ask them about whether they examine themselves for testicular cancer lumps. That was my first very glamorous job in telly.
What was your title? Was it assistant, production assistant? You remember?
It was a researcher.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, researcher. Yeah, that's kind of in the terminology is slightly different in the UK than the US. So if you're on the production side rather than the production management side, so the creative rather than the money, then the kind of lowest rank is, I suppose, a runner, and then a researcher, and then an assistant producer and a producer, and then director sometimes comes along with it. And then if it's a show that has a series producer and executive producer. So yeah, I was definitely the lowest of the rung there. But I think telly, like lots of things, once you've got one TV job on your CV, it makes a lot of difference to getting the next job.
And do you remember what the next job was?
Yeah, so the next job was at RDF, and it was, I mean, this really dates it, because it was an advert in the Guardian newspaper saying, we want, we're looking for a researcher for a new documentary that we're making for Channel 4. And at the time, RDF was a really small production company with just a few people that worked for it. They had a kind of light entertainment bit that had a few more people, that they just made kind of short light entertainment films, like, here's the man who has to warm the Queen's loo seat as a job, like little 3-minute entertainment things that they would sell to TV places around the world. It was a distribution company as much as a production company. And they were just starting up on a kind of more serious news and documentary division. And they put in an advert because they basically just reached the point where they were making more things than the people who worked there could make. So like 3 programs instead of 2. And so they advertised for a researcher. So I applied, sent my CV, and then got an interview. They told me what the job was, or what the program was. And it was a science documentary, again for Channel 4, for a series which was on then called Equinox, which took a different topic every week. And, it was an hour-long program about that topic. And this one was about encryption. And I remember the interview because I remember there were two people interviewing me, and I remember them saying, so, where would you begin if you were researching this documentary? And I literally had no idea what encryption even meant. So I said I would have to start with the dictionary and look up the word encryption and kind of take it from there. Anyway, somehow I got that job. Yeah, and then ended up staying at RDF for many, many years and kind of growing as the company grew.
What made RDF different from other production companies at that time?
I mean, to be honest, I didn't have massive experience of other production companies, but I think it was a very fertile time in TV in this country, because partly because Channel 4 was still relatively new, and it was a new broadcaster who produced solely from independent production companies. So there was a lot of new production companies around, and there was a lot of opportunity, it felt like. And it was run by a man called David Frank, who had, I think, probably quite an unusual combination. So a lot of the production companies were just set up as sort of ways of people who wanted to make TV programs to be able to make them, almost like as a kind of glorified hobby that earned them enough to live on, but wasn't really setting out to be a money-making venture. Whereas David's background was in business, so he worked in the city and then worked in the BBC business unit, and so he came to starting a TV production company with kind of a half creative head and half business head. So from the beginning, he was thinking not just in terms of making shows because he loved making TV and that was all it was about, but also thinking about how can we make TV that we love and enjoy making, but that also makes money and will help the company to grow. So I think that was quite unusual. Yeah, I guess we just really hit it off. I think that he has a good balance, still has, and certainly had then a good balance of seriousness about kind of trying to do things as well as you possibly can, but also a bit of a kind of cowboyish, let's just give it a whirl, let's throw ourselves in and sort of try and flap about and learn it as we do it. And I think I quite like that approach. It was quite exciting. It was quite, he embraced any kind of innovation in ideas or practices or, just let's just have a go at this thing. He was very much a kind of entrepreneur in that way.
What was the first, you said Equinox. What was Equinox?
So Equinox, there were kind of two strands, which were big science strands on TV here at the time. And a lot of them then got made or sold to Discovery Channel and Learning Channel and History Channel in the States. And Equinox was it was a series that ran for many, many years on Channel 4. And it was each week, the episodes of it weren't connected in any way other than by kind of having the editorial voice of Equinox. But they were they would just take a single subject. So I made one, that first one was about encryption. I made one about non-lethal weapons. I made one about icebergs. I made one about dirt, about how, I was thinking about this in the light of what's going on at the moment, but it was about how our removal from so many aspects of the natural world have made our bodies have less tolerance of foreign bodies. And it was called Eat Dirt, and it was kind of they all were slightly provocative. So there was another one called Dr. Satan's Robot, which was kind of about how the arts have traditionally demonized science and the negative effect that that's had on science. So they always had a slight position, like even the one about icebergs. It was kind of a, beautiful natural history film where we went and filmed in loads of great locations to shoot icebergs. But it was also about, this was kind of 25 years ago, it was about global warming. It was about how, icebergs and how they are shed will change as the climate heats. So they were about all kinds of different subjects, but they were united by a kind of Channel 4-ish voice, which is always a bit different from the BBC voice, which is a bit more traditional and a bit more straight. Channel 4 always wants to slightly more push people's buttons and, provoke.
How long did it take you to work up from researcher to the production level at RDF?
Well, I think because not very long is the answer. I think because at the time, I joined RDF just at a time when their trajectory was, on a very steep slope, because the difference between having 2 shows in production and 3 shows in production is huge when you're that small. And recruiting people obviously is difficult and takes time. So if you've hired someone and you think they're good, then you're probably going to be more likely to give them the first chance to sort of, to take the next step up the ladder than somebody else. So I think probably I did, one show as a researcher, the next one as an assistant producer, and then, was producing by about the 3rd or 4th show. Yeah, so yeah, pretty fast.
Was Equinox the first show where you had a producer credit? Or was it a different program?
No, it was Equinox. Yeah, it was Equinox.
I want to talk about Scrapheap Challenge. Was that the first show that you ever pitched to RDF? And if not, what was?
So the way that it worked, so I was a staff member at RDF. So after I was hired to make that first show, but then pretty quickly I was given a staff contract. So I wasn't really then pitching to RDF so much as pitching with RDF to Channel, to broadcasters who would then fund our programs. So no, Scrapheap Challenge was, the way Equinox worked was that we would come up with lots of ideas for what shows could be about, and then we would pitch them to, at the time, a woman called Sarah Ramsden at Channel 4, who was the commissioning editor for Science. So she was the gatekeeper for whether shows would be, those sort of single one-off shows would be picked up. But through dealing with her and then making shows with her, we then built up a relationship and got to know what, one another's likes and areas of interest and expertise. And she also, so the degree human sciences at Oxford is very rare. Like there's only 20 people every year who do that degree, and not many other universities do it. I think UCL do it and maybe 1 or 2 other places. So when you meet another human scientist, you kind of have this immediate connection with them. And Sarah Ramsden, it transpired, had also done human sciences at Oxford a few years before I had. And so we had a common language, I think. And so it meant that because how commissioning certainly worked then. I've been out of it for quite a while now, so I don't know how much it's the same, but it was very much about partly obviously the idea that you're pitching and things like, have you got access to particular people or places? But it was also a lot to do with the relationship and understanding that you would have with particular commissioning editors, such that when they would have a need, you would be one of the people that they might go to express that need. So after we'd pitched and been commissioned to make quite a few episodes of Equinox, and I think a few other series, like, I can't remember exactly the order of things, but there was a series that we made about Mars. There was a series called 6 Experiments That Changed the World. We were starting to kind of dip our toes into series rather than one-off programs. And the starting point, or the kind of like the first thing that actually led to the ideas, which ended up being Scrapheap, were part of Sarah, as in her role as science and technology or whatever commissioning editor, saying, we never find a way of doing engineering on TV, because the BBC do stuff like the world's most impressive buildings, or, like the kind of landmark documentary series. And what's a way that Channel 4 might be able to do engineering and do maths and there was a kind of long list of subjects that they felt that they weren't really representing. So we then scuttled off back to RDF with, by that time we had a development team who we would work with on ideas, and started trying to come up with ideas for engineering shows. And I think also at that time was when formats were just taking off. You know what I mean by a format, a TV format, like something that can then be replicated in other countries.
Franchise, yep.
Yeah, as well as selling the actual programs, you might sell the idea for the program for somebody else to make. So that world was just kind of becoming a big thing. And obviously, if you're an entrepreneur, as David was, then you're very interested in formats because potentially they're much more lucrative than just making a 1 hour documentary, which of course you might then sell to lots of places, but it's still only 1 hour of TV. Whereas if you can make formats, then they can be recommissioned, they can be made in, 190 territories if they're really successful. So we were also trying to think of things that we thought could potentially be returning formats. So it wasn't so much thinking of a one-off landmark show where we documented how the Empire State Building was created or whatever, but things that could recur. And there were many iterations of what ended up being Scrapheap Challenge. So there was an idea that we had, I can't remember exactly what it was called, but what the kind of working title was, it was never made, but where we were trying to find historical examples where a crisis had been solved thanks to kind of engineering ingenuity. So like wartime stories where, prisoners of war would somehow escape by an incredible use of, tunneling know-how, or someone stuck in the desert who would know how to recreate some kind of fuel out of doing degrading sand in some way. Slightly, it was quite hard to find really good examples. And then there was a conversation one day. So there was a producer who worked at RDF called Eve Kay, who was who was on the development team. So was part of the group of people who were coming up with ideas. And it was the time that the movie Apollo 13 had come out. And we talked about the scene, the sort of famous scene from that movie where the carbon monoxide filter fails and the box of ingredients is, of the ground control realise, right, this is all the stuff they've got up there from, food wrappers that have been discarded to toothbrushes to God knows what. And they have this pile of stuff and they think, how can we turn this into something? And I think that was a key moment, because that was when the idea of, I suppose, what that moment encapsulated was pressure of time. It was a finite set of resources, and it was a very clear target of, a goal that had to be completed. And so it's pretty clear, I suppose, the links to a scrap heap. And to be honest, I can't exactly remember the moment at which somebody said, a scrap heap. Although we had talked about Mad Max, because that was another show that had, I guess those films had come out in the years before. And, there's a lot there about using whatever is available to you to turn into something else. So like most ideas, it kind of was about a sort of, primeval soup of these ingredients floating around, and then a bit of lightning that somehow transposed that into the idea for the show. And then once you've got an idea, so I think once we kind of came on the idea of an actual physical scrap heap, then it went quite quickly, because then it felt clear that you had to have, well, I think we started off with the idea of a team, like in the movie, a team against the clock, but actually pretty quickly thought a team against each other is much better than a team against a clock. And if there's a team against each other, then that naturally lends itself to having some kind of head-to-head contest at the end of it. And then we just liked the idea of trying to film something over the course of a day. So initially it was kind of a sunrise to sunset challenge, and the idea was we'd get everyone up at the crack of dawn, shoot through the day, and then at the end, when the sun set, we would have amazing lighting, and we would shoot the contest straight afterwards. Sorry, I probably jumped out very many sketches. I'll stop for breath.
How long from the initial idea to the idea before you pitched it to Channel 4? How long did it take to develop the idea? Do you recall?
I'd say it was maybe, pitching wasn't kind of like a one-off thing. Like now, and certainly from my experience in the States, when you pitch a show, you kind of do loads of the work and then you build up this big kind of deck and you go and pitch it almost like, Mad Men style. Whereas here, it was much more a kind of to and fro process where, we got this kind of idea from Channel 4. They would quite like to find a way of tapping engineering. We probably went back with a few sort of like fairly top line notions. I think that we actually got money to develop the idea of the historical recreations, like when engineering had solved real genuine historical problems. And so we went a little bit down that route, but that route then led us to Scrapheap, the first stages of Scrapheap. And then we would go back to Channel 4 and say, hey, look, we're excited about this new thing. They might give us a bit more money to look at the feasibility of it. So it was it wasn't like a kind of big all or nothing thing. It was more like quite a lot of toing and froing. But nonetheless, it was I remember the moment, the sort of massive moment of, and so sorry, I think that toing and froing probably went on for about 6 months maybe. And then I think from when we'd actually, had something which was recognisably Scrapheap, because it was called Scrapheap before it was called Scrapheap Challenge, I'd say then it was probably another, 3 or 4 months before Channel 4 commissioned a pilot. Because actually what we realised was that it was going to be a pretty expensive show to make. Because to have to have a Scrapheap to begin with, and to have the camera coverage that you would need to follow the progress of two teams building machines, during which time you would never quite know when the interesting things would happen. It wasn't like a scripted show where it was like, obviously, like the bit when they go on the first date, that's going to be key. It was like, well, they might have a crisis and set fire to something in the first minute or in the 10th hour. So we knew we'd have to have quite a lot of cameras there for quite a long time, like long enough that they would have to be on shifts and people coming in and out. There was obviously a massive kind of health and safety aspect to it. The scrap heaps, you don't get big scrap heaps big enough to film in central London. So we were going to have to ship a load of all the team members, all the crew, all the production somewhere else. So it was quite a big thing for them to commission the pilot. And for us, RDF, it was a big deal when we got that pilot commission. And I remember kind of walking out of the meeting with David and clicking our heels together and going to the pub to have a celebratory pint, because we kind of knew that there was, it was a big deal.
Did Channel 4 have any reservations to the project or any concerns?
Oh, yeah. I think we all were very uncertain whether it would work. It was quite possible that we would shoot for all this time, and at the end of it, we'd have two slightly crappy machines that didn't do anything. So I think there was kind of functionality concerns. There were obviously health and safety concerns, because we were, letting people loose in a junkyard, and it became clear fairly quickly as we started looking into it that we weren't going to be able to just use a completely totally genuine scrap heap, that we would have to construct it to some extent, otherwise it would just be too dangerous. And it was also apparent that we needed a bit more control over what was in the scrap heap, because, whether an engine works or not is kind of the difference between us having a show or not. So we had to, for safety reasons and functionality reasons, we had to sort of make a scrap heap that looked, and actually, the third reason is aesthetic, is that a lot of scrap heaps look kind of ugly and boring. And we wanted a scrap heap that would look exciting and like something on a TV entertainment show. So for all those reasons, I mean, for the pilot, this didn't quite happen. For the pilot, it was more like a normal scrap heap with a few extra bits. But we realised one of the kind of obvious learnings from the pilot was that we would need to do much more to control the look and contents of the scrap heap.
Were there any other changes from pilot to series that come to mind?
Yeah, there were quite a lot. You wouldn't have seen the pilot.
It's online.
Oh, is it? Okay, so the pilot, I mean, it was pretty, it kind of cranked the Mad Max quite high, and it had sort of these slightly ostentatious pieces to camera talking kind of in, not quite in verse, but it was all very, comrades, the early morning is with us, and it wasn't that relatable in some ways. So I think we toned that down. I think, because obviously we changed host from the pilot to the series, and I think that's because we realised that the host was going to be much more important than we'd originally realised in terms of creating a lot of the content for the show and a lot of the narrative of the show, that we couldn't rely on the teams to narrate the story without someone there to help it come out of them. And so the initial idea of having someone who was kind of great at hosting any kind of show, like a cookery show or a travel show or whatever, and just putting them in the scrap heap wasn't going to work. We needed someone who was much more kind of excited by and genuinely into the idea of the miracle of these people making stuff from nothing. So that was another quite big change. And then, yeah, I think so. The setting changed, the presenter changed, the kind of choice of participants changed to the extent that, I mean, it wasn't really changed, but I think we maybe realised how much it was essential to have people not only who could build stuff, but who could talk. I can't really remember how that balance, like with the pilot, how we'd thought about that. I think that maybe when we were thinking about the pilot, we had thought, oh, it's really important. Obviously, as a woman, I really wanted to have equal numbers of men and women. And so we would, so we cast for reasons other than the ability to weld, the ability to kind of like bodge a solution in quick time. And I think that when we got onto the show, we realized that actually if we did want to stick to certain things like a very strict time constraint, we absolutely couldn't have anyone other than really good people who would actually be building the stuff. So, I mean, that wasn't so much a change as, I guess, a sort of, that was more a kind of, slight readjustment of priorities. And other things like, I mean, we did, actually, I think, because we actually, funnily enough, I think a lot of changes that we made were between series 1 and series 2, as much as between the pilot and the first series. Because I think with the pilot and the first series, there were so many things that we had to change. Like changing location was massive, changing host was massive, that I think it then took the making of a series to realise, to understand more about what was and wasn't feasible in the time, what was and wasn't good about the narrative, not just within an episode, but within a series. Because I think the format for the first series was, there were regular teams who would meet each other week after week after week, and they would build up a score. But obviously a problem with that is what happens if one team wins the first 4 weeks, then what are the last 2 weeks for? They can never catch up. And so it was then between series 1 and 2 that we realised it would make it better if it was a knockout. So it was much more all or nothing. You win, you go through, you lose, you go home. And I think even more than, so like between pilot and series 1, we'd realised that we needed a host who was really into it. And then series 1 to series 2, we realised they needed someone to talk to, because there was a limit to how much we could keep going in and talking to the teams when we were also saying to them, get on, move on, you've only got 5 hours left, 4 hours, 3 hours, and then we couldn't then hold them up for half an hour while we were kind of like redoing interviews with them. And so we thought it would give another dimension to it. And also we wanted to have a permanent woman, because it was really difficult finding women engineers with the skills and the desire to be on the TV show about that. But we didn't want it to become a total boy fest. So we thought, well, if there's a permanent presenter who's a woman, then at least there's, in every show, we know that there's going to be a little bit more of a balance. So that was another big change. And then I think we also changed things about the look. Like, series 1, we still had them looking slightly Mad Maxy with just these hints of what team they were on. And by series 2, we were like, the Mad Max thing had been toned down even more. And it was more just like, let's make it really obvious, the blue team and the yellow team. And we tried to cast the teams much more for a team character. So, like they'd be 3 people who were all reverends of the church, or 3 university professors, or 3 bikers, or 3 people in the Navy, or whatever. And I think that was another change that came sort of like in a phase 2 change. I think from series 2 it changed less, but I think there was a big change. I think there were as many changes from series 1 to series 2 as from pilot to series 1.
So who was the host of the first series of shows?
So it was still Robert. So Robert Llewellyn was the host throughout the whole, from series, so other than the pilot, he did all of the UK shows.
And how was he cast?
So this has always been a bit of a joke between us, because we were trying to think laterally about hosts, because we wanted to have somebody, because we realised that it was potentially a bit of a niche interest having an engineering show. So we wanted to find somebody who came from the world of entertainment who would have this kind of interest. And it's not obvious who those people would be. But I vaguely was aware of this show called Red Dwarf that I had never actually seen. But I talked to a researcher and I kind of said, look, I'm sure there's going to be somebody in that Red Dwarf. It's kind of a geeky, nerdy, Trekky sort of show. And I bet there's someone in there who is worth trying. And then, they kind of came up with the name of Robert. And then so we'd met various other sort of entertainment-y people who we then interviewed, but they obviously didn't really have that much interest in engineering. They were just trying to get a job. And we'd interviewed engineering-y people who we thought maybe we could sort of, put a firework up and make more entertaining, and that didn't really work. And then as soon as I met Robert, I just thought he's the perfect person. He's totally into it. He totally got the thing. Because I think the thing that I've always loved about the show from the first moment is that it was kind of, it's about creativity. That's what I love. Like, my whole thing in life is like about creativity. And this was a show about creativity in people for whom creativity is not normally celebrated, certainly not on mainstream television. And I think that Robert totally got that. He totally, kind of was sort of awestruck by the fact of people being able to create things with their bare hands out of stuff which, even if we had created the junk, it's still the junkyard, it was still junk, it still genuinely was rubbish. And he just got that, and he was funny, and he's a lovely guy, and we got on really well. And that was really, and he was also up for, because in series 1 there was still quite a bit of mad, he was in his goggles with his cloak and, still kind of speaking in German, and, there was weird stuff, but he was always very game for that stuff, totally thespy and, not diva-ish at all, just a total laugh and lovely, down-to-earth guy. So, that was a perfect fit.
And who was the co-host for the second series?
That would be me.
And how did you get that job?
Well, so I kind of told you the sort of ideas that so I'd produced the first series, and so obviously I knew it inside out, and Channel 4 were really keen on this idea of a second host being a woman, and so was I. And we tried out lots and lots of people, and there were at least 2 or 3 who I thought were pretty good, who I think could have done it. They weren't necessarily engineering experts, but they were scientifically literate and, had presenting experience. But Channel 4 vetoed all of them for one reason or another. And it got to literally, I mean, it was like 2 weeks or 1 week even before we were due to start shooting. And we still hadn't had anyone that they had approved. And then I think it was actually Dan Chambers, who was he was Sarah Ramsden's kind of second in command, said, "Oh, Cathy, why don't you do it?" And, you know, of course I was like, don't be ridiculous. I'm far too busy. And the last thing I want is the pressure of being on camera when I'm actually worrying about all the things that are happening in terms of producing the show. But it literally got to the point where it was either I do it or we don't have a co-host. And I thought, on the plus side, I thought, well, I do know, because obviously I'm working with the production team about all of the notes on all of the different, you know, I'm working with Robert on here's what this week's challenge is all about, and here's the things that are going to be really hard, and here's what makes this kind of machine work really well, and here's what would make it really fail, and blah, blah, blah. So I kind of had to be across all of that stuff. And so eventually I just thought, well, I might as well give it a go. And how I approached it was thinking, well, kind of, I'm just going to do the things that I would do anyway, but on camera, you know, so naturally as a producer, I would go into the teams and kind of say, how's it going? And what problems have you got? And do you think you're going to finish on time? And what's that bit for? And are you sure you want to do that? And are you kind of getting on okay? So I would sort of do some of that in producer role anyway. So I just kind of, did it in producer role on camera. And I think because me and Robert got on, and because it always felt very much like he was the main host, you know, because he'd held it by himself and I was there as a sort of just as an extra. It kind of was sort of not a big deal in a way, except, you know, the pain of having to sort of look half decent rather than show up in your tracksuit bottoms with greasy hair.
What type of machines did these contestants have to build? And how did they test them at the end of the day?
So the first series, we still did. So we shot, there were 6 shows. In the UK, we often have short series, unlike America, where it's always 13. It was just 6 shows in the first series. And 3 of the 6 challenges we shot that night. So we did literally do the thing of, right, okay, down your tools. You've got an hour to kind of do a last minute weld or whatever panic stuff needs to be done for health and safety. And then we're going to do the challenge now at night in the scrapyard. And the other 3, I think we shot the next day. So the ones, God, I don't know if I can remember them all. I remember the ones we shot at night because they were very dramatic. So the first one were siege engines. So like, you know, one of them built a trebuchet and one built a mangonel, you know, like kind of medieval devices for chucking stuff. One was power pullers, so like, you know, tractor pull things where they pulled against each other, which was that very close to giving me a heart attack, that one, because I thought someone was it was just so high adrenaline, that particular show. And then what was the third nighttime one? Can't quite remember. And then we did a boat, you know, a power boat and land yachts. Was that series 1? They all slightly blur after a while, but there was definitely something on water. There was some kind of hovercraft was the pilot. Anyway, sorry, that's not very interesting, listening to me trying to delve back into my memory.
No, you're fine.
But yeah, what was the question? Sorry.
How did you measure a competition with these types of things? Would they have a race? Would they have a...
Yeah, so there was always, sometimes it was a race, like if it's boats, it would be a race. If it was like with the siege engines, it was, you know, there was a target, there was kind of a figure in a castle at the end of the junkyard, and it was who would get the most hits or the closest hits. For the power pullers, it was who would cross the line. So we always tried to make it be a very, you know, not a question, not a sort of vote of who thought the machine was the most creative. It was an objective measure of success. The fastest, the strongest, the tallest, the, you know, whatever.
What was the initial reaction to the program when it aired from critics and viewers?
I mean, I think it was a mixture of kind of, I think it got pretty good reviews that were all with a slightly kind of raised eyebrow, what the hell is this sort of thing? Because it looked really unlike other things on telly. You know, we had people in costumes, Like, that wasn't a thing. There weren't engineering shows on the telly. There were a few people, I think, who made connections back to the Great Egg Race, because that was sort of the last time on telly, which I guess was maybe 20 years earlier, where there had been a show on telly which was about these kind of slightly crazy inventor types, but ours were much more dirty fingernail inventor types. So it was more about the kind of ideas and the creativity that was the link. But I think it got a pretty good reception, and it was very much a word of mouth sort of show. So it aired on a Sunday early evening slot, and it really kind of grew in a word of mouth show steadily over the sort of series, series 1 to series 2 to series 3, as it became a sort of big family viewing thing. And actually it's funny because just in the last, year, my son, the one who popped in briefly, has become really interested in it. And it is a really lovely show. I haven't watched them since we made them really, but it's a lovely show to watch with kids because we did want to teach people stuff. We wanted to celebrate this great creativity, but we also wanted to kind of explain torque. We wanted to explain lift. We wanted to kind of actually make it be about a sort of, educating people about machines that we all use but don't really understand. So I think there's always people who are going to be like, what the hell is that show? That is not my bag. But I think in terms of the people for whom it was their bag felt very, very attached to it because there was nothing else like it for them.
And how long did it go before you first sold the British version to the United States, to the Americas?
It was fairly early on. I think it was it was after I think that they were aware of it after series 1. There was a woman called Jana Bennett who had been at the BBC at the time that it was made, and then got a job as head of the Learning Channel in the States, so based in Bethesda. And she had, I think, originally just showed the British shows, and I think had been surprised by how well they'd gone down. And I remember having conversations along the lines of, do people like it because it's this kind of freaky Brit thing? Or do people like it because of what it actually is at its essence, to the extent that they might want one of their own? And I think there were probably two. I think the first and second series of the British show were shown before an American version were made. And the first and that came about really through them. So they first bought it as an acquisition and just showed the British show, and then approached us about making an American version and how that might work. And for the first US show, so the first show called Junkyard Wars, was actually filmed on our British Scrapheap. So we had this slightly ridiculous situation where we were shipping knackered old American cars from the States, or trying to find them in junkyards in Britain, so that the junkyard looked vaguely American. And obviously bringing all the teams over from America, bringing the American host over. Yeah, so that the first US series was made in the UK, and then the next UK series was filmed in the US. So then we realized that actually it was kind of, I don't know, for kind of reasons of, trying to make it be affordable to do on the budget, we didn't want to create two completely separate sets. So we, the first one we brought the Americans over, and then the second one we thought actually maybe now is the time to set up an American office to make Junkyard Wars. And so that's when I moved to America to run that office, set up that office and produce the show. And we built a set there, and then having built the set there in America, I mean, obviously one thing that LA offers compared to the UK is many more months in which you can film. And so, with the weather being good. And so that next year, we then we did the opposite, basically. We brought British teams and British scrap back over the Atlantic to film with them in LA. And I think that only happened maybe for one or two series. And then at that point, we realized that each show was kind of a big enough thing on its own. And the kind of cost of flying people everywhere. And at that point, we realised that it made more sense to split them back up. And Scrapheap carried on in the UK and Junkyard Wars carried on in the States.
Other than the name change, were there any big differences between the British and American series that come to mind?
I think, there is a bit more bombast in American TV, and there's a need for things to always grow and become more supreme and mega junkyard and ultra mega super junkyard, and even more so, I think, than the UK. So there was, I think whereas the British show probably had more tolerance for eccentric challenges, like we did one which was called a mileage marathon, where the challenge was each team was given a fixed amount of petrol, gas, and they had to build a machine that would go as far as possible on that amount of gas. And that kind of slightly more obtuse challenge, I don't think would wash so much in the States. I think where actually the physical look of it, the drama of it, I think needed to be slightly ramped up. And we had a lot of discussions because around that time was when a lot of format shows were taking off, and there were a lot of, the more reality shows happening, and a lot of them were about kind of video cameras and, people sort of bitching secretly behind each other's backs. And we had a lot of discussions, and I think I pushed back quite a lot on moving the show to let's get the team members in there and sort of speaking to video camera and slagging off the expert. But we did have a bit more of that. There was a little bit more kind of, so-and-so's not getting on with the sort of personal drama. But I think we never wanted to kind of overplay that. Yeah, other than that, not massive changes, really. Certainly not for the first series. But I think that, probably shows, it's easier to burn out in the States, because I think that what happened with the show, I can't even remember how many American versions there were, but it felt like 5, okay. It's sort of, I think that what American TV production companies are really great at is seeing something that's good in an idea and blowing it up and taking it somewhere else. And I think that we probably were not quick enough to do that. Obviously, ideally, if you're a production company, you do that to your own shows. You kind of, you feast off your own babies. Gosh, that sounds horrible. And I think that we were a bit slow to do that, but actually other people did it really well. And I think there were shows that, was it called Junkyard Dogs? The Junkyard Dog? What was that show?
Describe it and I'll see if it comes to mind.
So it was basically a show which I think really did take the extremes of reality show casting. Let's find larger than life characters and make them the center character of a show. They merged that with the What's Best About Junkyard. And it was a show where there was this brilliant character who ran a junkyard, or who called himself the Junkyard Dog or something. Oh God, it's really bugging me what it's called. And he would make machines, he had a team, but it was much more kind of character driven. It wasn't about teams competing against each other and little graphics showing you how lift works. It was much more about, it replaced that stuff with sort of larger than life characters who got angry and swore and put other people down. Do you know the show I'm talking about?
Was this and this was in the United States?
Yeah, it was in the States. It was on Discovery Channel, I'm pretty sure. Anyway, it's not important really, but I think that what I felt in terms of the direction of travel of the show was that things had to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And there was just a limit to actually what was possible, what was credible in terms of saying this is something the teams have made in a day. And the other thing was that it felt like there were lots more shows around. Like we had our window of time of a few years when it felt like we were the only kid on the block. And then actually there's one show that I haven't mentioned that I should kind of give reps to, which is Robot Wars, which was a big show in the UK around a similar time, which, I definitely see as being our kind of brother or sister in many ways, because there were a lot of similarities of that show. So those shows were very much around. but they were like, I think the sort of dirtiness of our show and the flying by the seat of your pantsness and genuinely not knowing when you said ready, steady, go, whether the machines would work properly or not, I think was ours. But it felt like we had a few years of relatively, without too many competitors, and then suddenly there were lots of competitors, and so they were pushing us to go bigger and bigger and better and better. And we did some brilliant specials. We did a special for the centenary of the first flight anniversary, which was a fabulous show. We did another one which was a special effects where we had the Henson Company and the Star Wars Lucasfilms lot, and there were some really great specials, but in a way they were fantastic in themselves, but maybe made the original show feel slightly kind of cottage industry by comparison. So I think it kind of burnt itself out.
Were there any builds or any particular episodes of the original series, British or American, that stand out in your mind as being particular, oh, that was a difficult shoot, or oh man, that was an amazing episode or an amazing build?
I mean, my favourite challenge, one of my real favourite challenges, was one called the Demolition Derby, which was in, I think it was series 2 in the UK. And it had this team called the Chaos Crew, who, I mean, I think are one of the best teams we've ever had. And everything went wrong during the challenge. Everything was blowing up about their machine. Things were spurting everywhere. Engines were exploding. And they just never gave up. They kept, like to the last minute, they would be welding and fixing it. And, it was amazing that nobody got injured because they just took such risks. But it was such an exciting finale to watch. That was a brilliant show. The flight special was a brilliant show. There was another show which was again kind of, it was the only time where we had to reshoot the test day, was because we did say ready, steady, go, and neither machine worked. And we tried, and then we just realized that day it was not going to happen. And that was actually walking machines, which were the slowest machines. And if you watch that episode, I think it was the final of series 2. It's absolutely hilarious. I mean, it just makes me cry with laughter watching it, because literally the movement, a slug would go faster than one of these machines, but somehow that difference of just that progress made the difference somehow between it being a success and being a disaster. But there were loads on flying machines. I mean, anything that ever goes in the air. So the flying special, but actually the first time we just did flying, gliders, was absolute kind of, nail-biting stuff. There was one where we filmed remote-control cars in the middle of Death Valley. And I remember, because quite often in the tests, Robert or the American host would be with the teams, and I would be kind of on the ground with the, like the roving reporter. And I did actually think I was going to die with the remote control cars, because there was this one of the cars just went completely out of control, and it really felt like it was racing towards me. And I kind of looked up, and they're all gesturing like they're trying to control it, but they have no control. So I was like running out of the way of this out of control armored car. That was quite memorable. They were all memorable. I mean, the tests were so great. It was just always so exhilarating seeing them work.
Yeah, you had, contestants building things like submarines and cannons and catapults. What were, some of those safety concerns with some of those builds, and how was safety handled on the show?
I mean, obviously you have to take those things incredibly seriously, and sometimes the contestants are your enemy, because they will be up for doing things and you're having to say, no, that is too risky. And with something like cannons, obviously, there's very strict laws governing what can and can't be fired. So we would have to obviously go by the letter of the law, and we would have, we had our health and safety advisors worked with us over many, many series. So like, I think with any production where there's risk, build up an understanding of what means what, because there's obviously things that are written down, but when you're making things that you're not predicting in advance, there's always going to have to be judgments that are made pretty much on the hoof. And so we'd have our behind the scenes engineering team who would work very closely with the health and safety person about what they saw as the risks, which were much more a kind of on the ground analysis of on the basis of this machine that has been actually built rather than on the basis of the theory of what these machines might do. And you do everything you can. And then, to some extent, you do just have to, everyone acknowledges that there's a risk. Even if you're building a little go-kart, then there's still a risk that someone's going to fall out of it. There were things, like from series 2 onwards and for all the American shows, we always built in a day in between the building and the testing, which was a safety day, which was when our engineering team and the health and safety people would be there, and they would sometimes say, this has to have a roll bar on it, or that weld has to be reinforced. So that was our kind of buffer area, I guess, between, from series 1, when literally they would then be flinging catapults right then. We realized that wasn't safe enough. And so, from then on, we implemented that thing of having the safety day. Yeah.
Were there any ideas that had to be scrapped due to safety or practicality?
I'm sure there were loads. I mean, there were always things. We always wanted to do helicopters. Like, I don't think we could ever do helicopters. There's certain things which it's just not possible to do in any kind of a safe way. Submersibles with people in them. Couldn't ever really do that one. Yeah, I think there were probably quite a lot. We had a few pretty outrageous members of the production team who would always be suggesting various kind of weapon-based things, which, I mean, I wasn't a massive fan of weapon-based things. I loved cannons, but I didn't want to go overboard with weapons stuff. But yeah, there were lots of things that sadly, maybe someone will bring it back one day and they can make a helicopter.
I hope so. It's one of the things that keeps me up at night is the fact that I can't watch it anymore. For the record, what was the grand prize for winning on Junkyard Wars?
Oh, it was an incredible cup made out of junk. The grand prize was an even better cup made out of even better scrap. I'm sure it must still be sitting on someone's shelf. You did get one a year. You didn't have to give it back. That was one thing. But no, they were beautiful creations. But yeah, I mean, that was another thing. There was no money. It was totally just for thinking, I'm really good at building stuff. That was what people were in it for. And a trophy.
The much-deserved bragging rights.
Exactly.
Did you work on the teen version of Junkyard Wars, Operation Junkyard? You're credited as it.
I did, because I was very involved in developing it and pitching it, but actually that show was made at the same time as I had to come back to the UK to make Full Metal Challenge. So I wasn't there was there for the pilot when we made the pilot, because obviously there was a big question there about, oh my God, what can kids actually do? And they amazed us about what they could do. But then the shoot was, it was filmed, the whole thing was filmed when I was in the UK, so I wasn't there for the shoot, sadly.
We brought up Full Metal Challenge. What was Full Metal Challenge?
So Full Metal Challenge was kind of meant to be the sort of Death Race 2000 answer to Scrapheap Challenge, where we did do things that were impossible in a day. And we had teams from all over the world, and it was still about machines, but this time it was about building one ultimate machine that would be put through the ultimate kind of stress test, if you like. So it was kind of like a circus or a fairground gone mad. So the different games were things that were familiar but on a massive scale. So you do 10-pin bowling, but your vehicle was the ball, and you do a game of football, but actually it was in a pit that was all on fire, and you couldn't escape from it until you scored a goal, kind of thing. And it was completely nuts. And if I'm honest, it suffered from, it was such a big show. And I think that now when I think back at it, and I have slight regrets about that show because I really wish that I hadn't had so many hats on. I think that because I presented that show, and I really shouldn't have presented that show, and we should have had somebody else who was there, who in a kind of producer role, who, because I was kind of juggling backwards and forwards between Junkyard Wars and that, and we should have had a live audience there. Like, it was such an incredibly exciting show to watch filmed, and that didn't really come across in the final show because at the time it was also really expensive. That was another reason for not having an audience. There was obviously massive safety issues of having a live audience, but it really needed one. It really needed one. And I think that at the time, it was I guess maybe a slight jumping the shark thing. I think that, Scrapheap Challenge was still doing really well. Junkyard Wars was doing really well. And I was kind of still somewhat involved in both. And we pitched this show, and it was a co-production between the same channels, the Channel 4 in the UK and the Learning Channel in the States. And I think there kind of wasn't enough scrutiny. Should have been more scrutiny of exactly what it was, troubleshooting the games more, insisting on certain things like an audience there, because the excitement of it, just, you needed that to be mediated through somebody. It wasn't enough through the camera. So it only made one series, and there were some amazing things that happened in that show. But it didn't get recommissioned, and I think that was a mixture of things. I think, the bar was higher then because there were many more shows in contest. It was a really expensive show, and it just wasn't quite as good as it should have been, if I'm honest. I think that, if we'd have had a chance, if we'd had the chance that we had between Scrapheap Series 1 and Series 2 with Full Metal Challenge, it would have been an amazing show, but it never quite had that. I think the whole world of TV had slightly changed in those, intervening 5 years or whatever, and maybe more. And we just didn't get that second chance, which is a bit of a shame.
A lot of people who watch Junkyard Wars, are now people who are working in the mechanical engineering industry. How does it feel? How does it feel to know that you've impacted people's lives, and you've impacted, in theory, the world by having so much effect on the way people, build stuff? Your show helped people become engineers.
I mean, I don't know how true that is, but there's nothing that makes me happier than the thought of that being true. Like, people sometimes in the UK would say, what was the happiest moment of making the show? And other than, the being there for the thrill of watching two machines slug it out, it would be something. There was a letter that I remember getting, I think after Series 1, from a 10-year-old girl who had written saying that she'd never thought of making anything before, but she'd watched the whole series of Scrapheap, and she was taking apart her dad had let her loose on some old knackered car, and she was taking apart a car, and I cried with happiness because, that's what you want, isn't it? That's what you want to inspire people. And I hope, the slightly sad thing about a lot of machines is that as things become so much more automated and digitized and technologized, that idea that you can lift up the hood of a vehicle and sort of poke about and understand what things do is becoming more and more removed. And so I don't know. I hope that it's not a sort of dying art. But if it is, then I hope that we did something to give it a good send-off.
Do you think that you had an effect on later shows that came out on things like this, things like Mythbusters, Brain Games, other sort of engineer/science type shows?
I don't know. You'd have to ask them. I'd like to think that in the way that I kind of think, that sitting watching the Great Egg Race when I was 10 was one of those little things that fed into then being involved with Scrapheap Challenge when I was 25. And I'd like to think that people would say the same, but you never really know. But yeah, let's hope. Let's hope that there's a generation of builders out there and a generation of producers who are all kind of keen to make crazy stuff and create crazy stuff.
What's the legacy of Scrapheap Challenge or Junkyard Wars, in your opinion?
I mean, there's still 2 minis in the bottom of a lake in the UK. So there's one. No, I kind of think what we've said. I do sometimes meet people, and somehow the conversation will get to, oh my God, Scrapheap Challenge, I love that show, and they'll talk about then getting involved in some crazy building project with their kids, and those moments are great. I love those moments, and I mean, yeah, I'm happy to hope that there are shows that have come since that have taken the baton and taken it somewhere else. I love those shows. I love Mythbusters. I love shows that are sort of cousins. So in a way, whether or not there's a direct link, I'm happy to celebrate them as part of the tribe of the great unwashed.
Junkyard for me was the bastion of what made the Learning Channel great for a long time. And now I don't know if you get the Learning Channel in England, but it's a much different beast now.
Yeah, I know. I'm hoping, I don't know, there's a lot of things changing about the world at the moment. And I think that, this pandemic has shaken up a lot of things. And I wonder whether hopefully one of the things that might shake out in our return to realizing what's important is realizing that actually projects like making stuff is actually really, really great. It just makes you feel good. It makes you feel like you've added something to the world. And I think that some of these shows, which are more and more about characters and, assassinating each other, metaphorically, obviously, that they don't really add to the sum of good in the world. So yeah, let's maybe hope that can be we sure as hell need some good answers to the climate emergency. So let's hope there's some crazy junkyard inspired inventors out there who are building things to suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere.
Professionally speaking, what is your proudest achievement in the world of broadcasting?
Yeah, I mean, it's, I think definitely in terms of all of the positive effects that I think, are there, I think it has to be producing, being involved with Scrapheap Challenge from the beginning to almost the end. And, there's other individual shows that I'm proud of, but that one I think is the one that, yeah, still resonates.
What advice would you have for someone who wanted to work in the world of broadcasting?
Oh, that's tricky because it's so different now. Because I think now, there's such a change in that you can make so much stuff yourself on your phone. You can literally make a TV show. You can shoot it, edit it, create it, narrate it. So it's very different. And I don't know, it would kind of depend on what somebody's sort of passion was. But I would say there's nothing to stop you trying something. Even if it's on a small scale, even if you think that you've got an idea which requires, massive sets and huge, dollars, there's nothing that will, if there's a kernel of a good idea there, you will find a way of making a version of it or even a taster of it or something yourself. And that will be what will get you through the door of somewhere, because people love things that people really believe in passionately. And I think that, even though TV is kind of such a cutthroat business and much more so now, I still think that people, that is what will seduce people. So make something. That would be my advice. Make something.
Thank you for taking the time to tell your story.
Pleasure. Lovely talking to you.